Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser. I'm the Baptist campus minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship. The peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. And we are looking at our series on the Sermon on the Mount, Words That Change the World. And this is lesson 5. And we're going to be looking at sex and sexuality in the teachings of Jesus. And I just want to say this specifically, that we've looked at, in the last video, we looked at 6 examples that Jesus used, 6 illustrations that Jesus used: murder, adultery, divorce, swearing oaths, turn the other cheek, or you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and then loving your enemies. These 6 examples, these 6 illustrations, and 2 of them, adultery and divorce, had to deal with sexual relations between men and women, how that enters on marriage, covenants, commitments, all sorts of things going on there. And because it is a very relevant topic in our culture, I thought it was good to take a break from going through the Sermon on the Mount and look at this topic specifically in a little bit more detail. Now, I am going to be looking at it from the perspective of a pastor, using the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus has said to springboard into some content throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament in those ways. So just some things right off the bat, especially when it comes to sex and sexuality. I am a moral absolutist in many things, not a moral relativist. I do believe there's right and wrong, and I believe there's right and wrong in how we engage with others sexually and sexual activity. And I don't find very many people who disagree with me on that idea. We all have some basic understanding that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Now, there's a huge bit of debate about what things are right and what things are wrong, what things are allowed and what things aren't. And I am okay with that being a conversation, as long as we come to the conclusion that there is right and wrong. For example, most people, if not all people, most people would view that pedophilia is morally wrong. And a lot of us would think you were some sort of moral monster if you disagreed with that children should not be engaged with sexually by adults. However, there's a huge debate on what is the definition of adult. When are you no longer a child? When do you become morally grown enough, mature enough to make sexual choices as if you were an adult? And cultures have had different conversations about that. But the basic premise is that there needs to be a certain amount of maturity in the human being and able to make those decisions. So I am coming from the position that there are moral right and wrongs, and those moral right and wrongs apply to the area of sex, sexual activity, and sexuality. So, and I believe, obviously, that Jesus, not that Jesus would agree with me, that's probably the wrong way to put it. I agree with Jesus on that issue. So as we move forward, I just wanted to clear that air, that there is this idea that there is a right and wrong out there. And we're not talking about if there's right or wrong. We're kind of trying to figure out what is right or wrong. So the other piece to it, I would say, is I also believe that human beings are more than just physical entities. I am not a materialist. I believe that there is a divine person who is separate from the universe. And I believe there's something in us that relates to that divine person, in a way that we are more than just the summation of the molecules that make us up. There is an I, there is a person there there is a spirituality, there is a soul in a human being. And I believe that we are more than just our physical presence in this world. So those are two basic understandings that will guide how I deal with this topic. Now, and speaking of that, sex and the whole person is this first video. This is week 5, lesson 5. You can find the other lessons on my blog post. We've worked up through the sermon on the mount up to and including all of chapter 5 now. And that was weeks. Basically, 1 was an introduction, 2 through 4 were chapter 5, and now 5 we're reworking something from chapter 5 as well. Some basic definitions, and probably a sociologist or psychologist would argue with these, or but these are just kind of, when I say words, this is kind of what I'm trying to mean by these words. Sexual activity. This is a lot broader than probably a lot of people would say. The entirety of our sexual actions, that include everything from intentional thoughts, so even stuff that don't, like the things we decide to use in our minds, to flirting, cuddling, hand holding, all the way to sexual intercourse, and actually our actions after that as well. Now, some hand holding is sexual, some hand holding is just not, some of it's out of fear, some hugging is sexual, some embracing is sexual, some embracing is definitely not sexual. So it's these actions that have anything that has a sexual connotation to them, is, I would include as sexual activity. Sexual behavior is the general habits and common practices of individual actions. Oh, sorry. The general habits and common practices of an individual that are formed by repeated sexual activities. So, sexual behavior is kind of the summation of our sexual actions. I believe repeated actions form behaviors. Behavior are those things that are kind of the standard of who we are, and what we practice becomes our behaviors. Practice over time becomes a behavior. So sexual behavior is those activities that we have practiced enough that they become habit forming, a part of our normal everyday life that we process and things like that. So yeah, sexual behavior. Sexuality is basically our sexual identity, our character that is formed through our previous sexual behaviors and combination of who we strive to be. So our sexuality is a part of our identity, a part of who we are, who I am sexually, which is a combination of our activities and our behaviors that have been habit forming. What have I put into my life so far that this becomes a part of who I am, but it also includes that which I hope to be, what I'm striving for, kind of an ideal, an identity of what I want to be in the future as well. And then sexual context, what our culture says, believes, enforces, and encourages about sex. And sometimes the sexual context is complicated because maybe the overall culture and a subculture that you're a part of have differing positions on sex and things like that. So your context gets complicated and convoluted. But those are kind of definitions that I'm going to try to strive for as I say things. I've tried to be a little bit more careful with these videos that will be this week. I actually had some stuff written down. Usually in these things, I just talk a little bit spontaneously, extemporaneous, but I wanted to be a little bit more serious with this. However, I am not working from a specific script. And so I'm going to try to use these definitions, but I can't promise that I will always use these definitions. Now, I will use sex, the term sex, because I want to be vague about that. It could be some combination, some sort of combination of any one of these in a sort of a vague. So sex, when I say sex, I will be intentionally not using a specific one of these and be kind of referring to maybe some sort of combination of multiple pieces of these things as well. It's going to be the generic, the vague term. Now, as we've talked about, and as you probably have seen throughout, we're bringing this into our conversation because Jesus talked about it. And you ever look around and wonder why so many religious figures, so many religions, so many cultures, we all seem to be dealing with sex and sexual activity, sexual behavior, sexuality? I mean, just about every major religion has something to deal with it. They don't all agree on that, but they talk about it. Just about every culture has some sort of sexual rules to it. Even like, I mean, we see like work cultures talk about how we're supposed to and not supposed to have sex with other employees or on the premises. Friend groups have rules like, you know, you know, don't engage with exes, don't engage with family members of your friends, things like this. I mean, just about any social context we have has some sort of sexual legislation, sexual suggestions, sexual advice, and rules there. And this is also true within Christianity. A lot of people talk about how, like religious groups shouldn't be talking about sex, but any group has some sort of rules about sex. We have some general stuff in our culture about like even free cultures that try to make sex as free as possible without legislation and rules as possible. That's only possible because that culture, that social group wants that to be their standard. They've created the environment, the social context, that sexual context of freedom and independence and individual ideas is possible. So even if we think we are not beholden to any social group about our sexuality and sexual rules that we follow, it's only because that social group has created the rules that allows us to think we are only individually responsible to it. So, with that said, obviously Christianity has some sexual content to it as well. And actually, if we look at it, I mean, the Old Testament, the Law of Moses, has several passages here. If you want to pause and look these up, it's very interesting. Some of them are fascinating, some of them are confusing, but there is a lot of content in the Old Testament that told people how they should practice their sexual activity. Most of it is sexual activity, which is very interesting. They don't talk too much about sexuality or even and a little bit about sexual behavior, but most of it is specifically sexual activity. And then we also see not just the laws from the law of Moses, but stories. So many of the Old Testament stories have contents that deals with sex and sexuality. Sodom and Gomorrah, Judah, Tamar, Esther, the Song of Songs is an entire book that deals with loving relationships, and there's a lot of probably euphemism in there. David and Bathsheba. I mean, you could probably think of tons more of these, but there's a lot going on in the Old Testament that deals with, tries to instruct with sex and sexuality. And you got to wonder, why does so many religions deal with it? Why do so many cultures deal with it? Why do social groups always seem to be talking about? Why did Jesus think it was important to talk about adultery? Why does sex matter so much? That's a very interesting question. Have you ever thought about it? And I have conversations with students a lot of times, and they're like, well, it could be less important than we make it, but it seems like so many cultures have made it so important that we might want to pay attention to that and actually ask why that is. Now, I'm going to draw out this here. This is the great commandment, and the second, Jesus answered, the most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Now, when Jesus was asked what are the most important commandments, he brings up this: love your God with all the parts of who you are and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, as Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, we use this verse to construct our discipleship process, and it looks something like this, like who we are as persons, and this is based on Dallas Willard's Renovation of the Heart. Who we are as persons deal with the heart, as that verse would say, which is the will, the seat of our will, volition, our choices. Deals with the mind, where we think, thoughts, imaginations, creativity. Deals with the soul, our feelings, emotions, affections, things like that. Deals with the strength, which would be coming out of the body. That verse, not just our body, but our ability to change physical energy into um, action within the real world, and then deals with our social context, our neighbors, loving our neighbors as ourself. This is, and who we are as a person, our personality, our identity, our personhood is not just the combination of these five parts, but it's also the organization and integration of them. How we put these things together, who we are in each of these specific pieces, and how we put them together is our identity. What choices we make, how we think, how we feel, how we use our physical body presence to engage the world around us, and how we engage our neighbors and love them and interact with them. That and how that is organized into a coherent, integral whole person is kind of our identity. Now, if we look at sexuality, we can see that sex affects all aspects of who we are as persons and affects it profoundly. We talk about the will, we talk about the heart, to choose and to be chosen. To be chosen to be in an intimate relationship with somebody, or just to have a physical interaction with somebody of a sexual nature, is one of the most important choices we have. And this can be evidenced by the idea of rape. One of the worst things that could happen to any individual is to be engaged sexually against their will. Our will is so important in our sexual choices. And then we look at soul and feelings. Our brain interpret chemical responses to external stimuli into feelings. Now, these chemical responses aren't the feelings; it's the interpretation of them. Because sexual activity, we release some of the most powerful chemical responses we can see. But those same chemical responses could lead us to interpret them as joy or shame. They run the whole gamut. So we feel deeply about sex. We feel either joy in sex or shame in sex or some sort of combination of that. And sex has a very, very strong feeling content. And then thoughts, memories of previous sexual encounters, or imaginations of hopeful future ones. It's often said that the brain or the thought life is the most important sexual organ. And this can be seen in porn. Porn is actually trying to take the mental piece of sex and sexuality and isolate it in images, words, text, video from any of the other physical, emotional, will sort of social contexts. Porn is kind of one of those ways that we engage the thought life in exception to the other pieces. And then, I mean, strength or body, that physical presence. Sex really could only happen between a couple specific body parts, but we actually choose, and we can see this in the fact that like nudity is a normal piece to sexual activity. We choose to try to engage much more of the physical body than is actually necessary. Than neighbors' social contexts. Like I've been saying, all cultures have some established sexual boundaries. And actually, to think about it, um, this idea that even without sexuality, without sex, reproduction doesn't happen, and there's actually no social context to go from there. So not only does the social context contribute to sexuality, but sexuality actually creates the social context. So we can see that all parts of who we are, will, mind, feelings, body, context, are engaged by sexual activity, sexuality, and not only engaged by that, but deeply and profoundly engaged by that as well. So this kind of highlights the idea that sex is a very, very human experience and a very, very significant human experience. How we engage sexually touches all of who we are and touches it all of who we are very profoundly. Here's some conclusions you could draw from this. This is why sexuality is part of our identity. It touches every aspect of who we are as persons, and sexual activity is an identity forming process. This also, in part explains why most cultures reserve sexual activities for adults only, and why we view sexual activity with children to be evil. Because it's such an identity forming process, we want people to be of such a certain maturity to engage in that identity formation. Because sex can impact who we are as people, we should have some baseline to do that, and we can actually, it gives us, if we're too immature when we engage in sex, it can drive our identity into places that are just not humane. um, Also, this is why most cultures have encouraged sexual activity to only be engaged with someone you trust, because it is so identity forming. You should be trusting that person who you are giving access to your identity to, and who you are, and, and who you have access to their identity as well. Marriage is supposed to pair individuals in such a way that their futures are intricately linked, making trust necessary and natural. If I'm married to you and that marriage is permanent, it is important for you to become a better person. So as I engage with you sexually in such a way to help create and form identity in you in a way that helps you be better. And I allow you and am vulnerable to you in such a way that I trust that you are going to engage me sexually in such a way that actually blesses me and improves me and develops me in healthy ways as well. Because sex engages who we are on such a deep level, that idea that we trust the person and that somehow our futures are intertwined, so that as we help form their identity, we are doing it in such a way that it is ultimately good for them. Now, some more things. This would call into question the idea of casual sex. It's not so much that you should not have casual sex, but since sexual activity is identity forming, it's almost impossible to have casual sex. Also, also the act of trying to isolate sexual activity as purely a physical process can cause the disintegration of the human person, when sexual activity was designed to aid in its integration. And it's interesting to look at this on the aspect of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is an ancient Greek philosophy that, the physical and the spiritual parts of a person were separate, and the things that happened to your physical body did not, could not, would not affect your spiritual body, your spirit. This is not, as Christians, what we believe. We believe that the physical body and the spiritual body, the spiritual person, are so intertwined that the idea of trying to separate physical from spiritual are just actually going to hurt and damage us as persons. The best persons we can be are ones that the physical and spiritual are intertwined in a way and integrated in a way. And sex can actually, when done properly, help this integration. But if we try to isolate sex as just a physical process, that actually can contribute to isolating the physical body from the other parts, from our mental, from our social context, from our spiritual, and kind of cause a disintegration, not only in our sexual behavior but in other behaviors as well. We want to integrate everything as a whole person together, and um, and the act of engaging sexual choices as only a matter of the will or a matter of the body without engaging the thoughts, feelings, social context also can produce a disintegration. And this actually is one of my complaints about how Christianity, current Christian culture, quite often engages in sex. We talk about it so much as an act of the will or something else, and we don't look at it as a whole person. And we find a lot of times that it is like we have created a disintegration in who we are as persons, that how those five parts of us are not integrated well when it comes to our sexuality or even when it comes to our entire personhood. um, a lot of people have been pushing back on purity culture and abstinence, which is not in and of itself a big deal, but how we teach it as emphasizing one aspect of the person and sexuality over the other four is can actually be unhealthy and disintegrating who we are as whole persons in a way. So here, how could sex help us become more like Jesus? How could it hinder that? Have you ever thought about that? Quite often as Christians, modern Western Christians, we don't really think about one, our physical bodies helping us be more like Jesus, our practices, our habits, our entire encounter with Jesus is just a thought process. And there's a lot of disintegration of the whole person that goes into just basic discipleship. But even sexuality, most of us as Western Christians see our sexuality as antagonistic to becoming like Jesus. But are there ways that our sexuality could help us be more like Jesus? If we made sexual choices with our will to think sexual thoughts and that developed sexual feelings that allowed us to use our body sexually in a social context, and that if all of that worked together in a way that formed us to glorify and worship Christ in the proper context, our sexuality, how we engage physically, mentally, emotionally, intentionally, and socially in the area of sex, could be one of the most important spirit forming, transformative processes in our becoming like Christ as we move forward. Now, I want to leave you with that, just to think through that a little bit, and just think about that. Could your sexuality, could your sexual activity, your sexual behavior, the formation of who you are as a sexual person, the culmination of putting all five pieces together in your sexuality, actually be something that you use to make yourself more Christ-like? Hmm. So, as always, there are three ways to join this conversation. These in person, actually, the in person will be delayed. Will be coming back in person soon. I don't have the exact details about that yet, but also these live Monday night 7 p.m. Conversations on Zoom and these weekly wrap ups on YouTube and WordPress. As always, I'm all over the Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Those links are in the descriptions below. Hopefully this conversation was helpful. I'm trying to put some of the theological pieces behind sex and sexuality from a biblical Christian perspective. If you have any comments, we'd love to hear from you. Drop them in the details below. Talk to you again real soon.